Okay, so tell us a little bit more about yourself. What led you down this path? What is there? Is there like a single moment or a single thing that really sparked your interest in remote work?
Yes, there's a very specific moment. So I am actually in Montreal, Canada right now, where I went to grad school at McGill University. And that was really my focus in life. So I was going to become an academic. And I went through a whole bunch of years of undergrad and graduate school and started teaching a class. My very first class started with about 350 students, ended with less than 150, and got the worst academic reviews in the history of the department. The department had been running for 187 years. So it was really, really bad. I remember walking into my supervisor's office and I said, I don't think I'm very good at this. And he said, no, you are not. And I said, okay, so what do you think I should do with the rest of my life? He said, you got to get pretty good at this teaching thing if you want to actually enter academia. So 4 weeks later, I threw a master's thesis under his door. I was out into the real world and I started my very first business, which was an online tutoring business. And that was back in 2008, which for people that don't know, that was way before we had Zoom or any other pieces of technology that we currently rely on today for remote work. And that business was actually running quite well. So I was running an online tutoring business that had dozens of tutors throughout North America and Europe. But the issue that I had is, and I remember this very, very clearly, I had a chip on my molar and I had chipped one of my teeth. So I went to the dentist and he puts you in the chair with the big, huge white light and all that kind of stuff. And he takes a look at my teeth and he gasped. And it's never a good idea when a health professional gasps when they look at you. And he said, Liam, which tooth are you talking about? You have literally chipped all of your teeth. And it was from me grinding my teeth. I was working 18-hour days every single day, recognizing that this is something that really fundamentally had to change. So both my dentist and my therapist had to sit down with me and said, you've really got to figure out how to do this differently. You've really got to figure out a new direction. And that's where I recognized that I wanted to be able to double down on remote work, because for me, it offered me the freedom to do what I really wanted to do. And significantly, as we were just talking about in the last talk, reduce my stress level so that I could experience my joy for as much as I possibly could.
Yeah, that jaw clench is real, right? That is a serious thing. I feel like it is an epidemic among, pretty much everybody I know. But yeah, I think that is, that's a huge kind of, a huge moment of like, oh, wow, okay, this is not great. I think that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the future that we're seeing of remote work. One of the things that we talked about, especially at the very start of the pandemic, when people were kind of figuring out like, how do I manage a remote workforce or a hybrid workforce? A lot of the stuff we talked about was working asynchronously. So can you tell us a little bit about how you see asynchronous management and what role it can play in the future of our workplaces?
Sure. And I think for probably a lot of people who are listening right now, they don't know what asynchronous management fundamentally is. So I'll give you a quick definition of that. So asynchronous management is working with people without actually communicating with them at exactly the same moment. So communication happens basically in a staggered way. So I'll send an email to someone, or maybe I add a comment inside of an Asana task or a Trello task or something like that. And then someone picks it up at a later time when it's most opportunistic for them to consume that information and help with that collaboration. I think a lot about old school television versus Netflix. So I don't know how old you are, but I remember Friday evenings, everyone would watch Friends, the TV show. It happened at 8:30 p.m. And if you missed it, you were not able to actually have all the conversations on Monday at school with all your friends to talk about what the hell happened to Chandler. And so that created a real problem. That is synchronous communication. Asynchronous communication is like Netflix. So I have every single episode of Friends that I could possibly think of that's waiting for me when it's most opportunistic for me to consume it. And that's effectively what we're talking about when we're talking about asynchronous management. So there's very little synchronous communication on things that are unimportant, like How were your numbers this week? That doesn't really matter, because if you create an asynchronous management mindset, you've already automatically documented all of that inside of your project management system or inside of your documentation. It's more conversations like, how are you doing? How's your stress level? What can I do to be able to reduce your stress level? That's what we reserve synchronous forms of communication for, so that we can actually have more intimate and more meaningful conversations from a management perspective, as opposed to focusing on what your numbers were and what you're planning on doing next week, which honestly, no one really cares about. So that model has actually been in existence for decades. And people don't really know this, but it only became really relevant during the pandemic, because we went from 4% of the US workforce working remotely in February of 2020 to 45% of the US workforce working remotely in March of 2020. It was a massive, massive shift. And so a lot of, absolutely. I mean, I remember at that point, there were a large company would want to talk to me about remote work, and maybe it would be like 100 or 200 employees. And I remember the first week that COVID really shut down the world, I had a G20 country that called me out of the blue and said, we have 560,000 employees and we made them remote yesterday. What do we do? And I said, I have no idea, because that's completely out of everything that I completely understand with regards to remote work. And they said, you were the first person that we could get on the phone. So there's a massive informational gap at that point and vacuum. So asynchronous management is, in my opinion, the best operating system to run a remote or a hybrid organization, because it allows for people to be able to consume information when it's most opportunistic for them. Maybe you want to be able to do your best work at 10 p.m. at night, not from a 9 to 5. Maybe you actually have, I have 2 kids. Maybe getting some work in at 6 a.m. is actually the most opportunistic time for you to be able to get that work in. It's allowing you to collaborate at those times, as opposed to the set in office 9 to 5 model, which I don't know if you know this. Do you know why we have a 9 to 5?
Oh, I do. And it is a depressing answer. Please share it with our audience.
Well, okay. So the one that I got in doing my research for the book was that during the Industrial Revolution, there was no lighting. So what we recognized is, and if you look at any old factory floor, they've got these huge, beautiful bay windows. It's because we had to have light in the factory in order to be able to operate. So that's why there's a 9 to 5, because that's when the sun came down, and then you'd go home because it would be dark. Thankfully, we have electricity. We have electrical lighting, so we can actually work whenever we want. And it's just a very, when you think about why we make the assumptions about the way that we work, a lot of the stuff is honestly wrong, or based off of information that was hundreds of years old and is no longer relevant, which is incredibly frustrating as well.
Well, and it kind of just, it dovetails nicely into this idea that you need to ask why we do the things we do. Because sometimes there are, the underpinnings are really valid. Like you said, you can't work in the dark. Well, then once the Industrial Revolution progresses, we get more electricity in places. The 8-hour workday becomes a champion of workers' rights, because the slogan that was promoted with it was 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours to do what we will. And so the idea became that you needed to have this like set up, like time for ourselves kind of thing. And so, like you said, when you go back and look about, okay, why do we do these things? Is it for a reason that is still valid, or is it for a reason that doesn't make sense anymore? So why are we limiting ourselves, in this way, and trying to stay within a rigid system that doesn't function the way we want it to anymore? Go ahead.
One of the best things that you can do on any subject whatsoever is ask yourself this singular question: what assumptions am I making from my conclusions? And you just basically nailed that. What assumptions am I making from my conclusions? So I assume that we should have a 9 to 5. So then let's test that assumption. Let's actually identify whether or not that's relevant or irrelevant at this point. And you think about that with regards to business, with regards to work, with regards to your social environment. If you can continuously ask yourself that question, you will become incredibly more successful. I can guarantee it.
Yeah. Love this. Okay, so let's talk about from the business perspective, from the perspective of these orgs, why are businesses asking people to go back into the office?
It's complicated, very, very complicated. So I would argue that there is a hyper aggressive leaning on conspiratorial pushback to the office. There was a recent study done by the CBRE, which is one of the largest real estate companies in the world, and they would really want people to be able to go back to the office. So this is a very interesting statistic. 76% of workers want to remain primarily remote. And primarily remote means the majority of their time working from home and a minority of their time working from an office. 67% of managers want them to go back to the office. And when you ask managers why they have that question, and this is happening at an alarming rate, by the way. I just got off a call with one of the largest researchers on remote work. He runs the Future Forum Institute under Slack, which was recently purchased by Salesforce. And the entire department has been liquidated because Salesforce is going back to the office. So all of the research that we were working on the last 3 to 4 years is all being basically undone because of this push back to the office. And when you really nail people and you ask them, well, is it about culture? Oh, it's about culture. We got to have people go back to the office because of culture. Well, remote workers have a higher cultural net promoter score than their on-premise counterparts. Well, it's about communication. It's about collaboration. Well, they're actually more efficient and they're more productive when they work from home. There's 27 studies that I've read. 26 of them have stated that remote workers are more productive when they work from home than when they're in the office. So when you really get down to the nitty gritty of it, and this is one of the biggest aha conclusions of my book that I had put out about 8 months ago. When I studied asynchronous organizations, we identified that on average, their managerial layer was 50% thinner than their on-premise counterparts. So that means in asynchronous organizations, and almost all successful asynchronous organizations are remote, we've identified that there are 50% less managers in those companies than in on-premise organizations. So this creates a really difficult situation where it's 1915, you're a horse, and the first Model T has just rolled off the production line. And you're thinking to yourself, I'm really concerned about these Model Ts that are rolling off the line. I think I need everyone to go back to the office because that's all I understand. That's the primary operating system that I use to be able to extract labor from this organization. But there's a better way to do it. It's asynchronous management. And once you adapt to that, there will be less managers inside of your organization, which is actually not a bad thing. It's actually a very, very good thing. And you'll be more productive because of it.
I think that's a really good point. When you do kind of break these things down, the reasoning behind why you want people there, the arguments against it don't really hold water. And I think the productivity aspect is one of those things that people not necessarily overlook, but that goes to the heart of it, right? A lot of the thing that Power to Fly saw when we were trying to encourage remote work pre-pandemic was a lot of the fear about like, well, how do we know people are working? How do we know, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, but if butts in seats is really your concern, there's ways to get around that. There's ways to, to monitor these things. But once you start pushing in that area, you realize like, oh, no. It's not that they want this specific thing. It's that they want familiar. They want what they know how to do already, as opposed to trying to see where this might be going. Now, when you're doing this research, what do you think that workers want when it comes to the remote work? Do you think that they are more in favor, or are you getting the impression they're more in favor of hybrid models, or are there very specific things that workers want when it comes to a remote workforce or a remote workplace?
I think the hybrid argument is somewhat difficult to be able to really focus in on, because there's working remote, which means you do not go into an office. There is on-premise, which means you're in an office all the time. And then there's hybrid, which is a huge gradient, right? Do you spend 1 day at the office? Do you spend 5 at the office? Do you only go in on weekends to the office? There's a whole bunch of different ways of looking at it. The data that I have researched and read is relatively clear. And there's actually some really great studies that we're going to be doing or we're going to be presenting at the next Running Remote in the next few weeks, which is showing very clearly that the majority of workers would like to be able to spend the majority of their time remote with 1 to 2 days checking into the office per week. That is the ideal workflow for the majority of employees. Managers, on the other hand, actually want the reverse. So they want Mondays and Fridays working remotely, and then the rest of that time, they want to be able to work in office. And it's quite funny when you think about those Mondays and Fridays, essentially what you're doing is you're just expanding your weekend, right? You're just expanding that weekend and making it bigger, which coincidentally reinforces the perspective that remote workers are not actually working. I think the exact moment that we ended up starting to see this pushback really gain steam was when Elon Musk put out that email to his internal employees at Twitter saying everyone needs to stop pretending to work from home and come into the office. It's not about whether or not you're working or not. It's about the accountability that you build inside of remote work. And so the problem that we're seeing right now is managers just can't actually measure what work is being done. And so that's the piece that needs to fundamentally change for us to be, and I think about this very pragmatically. When I see the changes that are currently happening right now, I'm not too excited about the future of remote work, or I'm very fearful of the future of remote work. And so therefore, I think we need to actually make a lot of pragmatic changes very, very quickly in order to be able to make sure that we save it from the direction that's currently going.
All right. So as you're talking to employers about, the impact of remote work within their orgs, what if any positive impacts do you see remote work having when it comes to DEIB efforts?
So I think there's two important factors that build into this, and that is distance bias and recency bias. So distancy bias inside of remote teams, and actually more specifically inside of hybrid teams where it's directly applicable, is when you actually see someone face to face, you automatically, and this is just a bias that everyone holds, you will usually do what that person says more often. I can give you a perfect example. We had a couple salespeople in my last remaining office that we had before we shut everything down, and we had these hangout spots. We had 7, and then we whittled it down to 1, generally because I like to really kind of just go into an office. I still worked remotely, but I worked from my own space. So we had 2 salespeople, and they were constantly hammering me saying, we need these 55-inch spaceship level monitors, like these beautiful $3,000 monitors. And I would hear them at lunch. We need the monitors. I would hear them when they come into the office. I would hear them on Fridays when they would leave. We really need these monitors, Liam. They're absolutely critical to our productivity. So I caved and I bought some. And then the very next day, I had the other 22 salespeople in the company saying, Caleb got a monitor. What about me? And so that's what creates that problem is you've got to be able to build that distance, and you actually have to purposefully put yourself, if you're interacting with people in person, you need to counterintuitively give more attention to your remote workers so that you are aware of that form of communication and you're recognizing that you're giving equal impact to both remote workers and in-office workers. The second one is recency bias, which is also a very popular form of bias. The last person that you spoke to is usually the person that you'll perceive of as correct. So Meg, if you say, hey, 1 + 1 = 2, and then I speak to Mona in 5 minutes and she says 1 + 1 = 3, then I will automatically, well, maybe that's a bit of an overgeneralization, but at least my perspective will be to take the opinion of the last piece of information that I had as opposed to the most insightful piece of information that I had. And so both of those things needs to be managed very effectively. And any manager that's really good at their job working in a hybrid environment, that is the number 1 and number 2 most important things that you need to be able to work with and fight against in order to be able to have a successful work environment.
Okay, so when we're talking about these ideas and these biases that are kind of operating behind the scenes here, what do you think businesses can do to make a hybrid model more successful, to by minimizing these types of bias, distance and recency?
So if I have a meeting with, let's say, 8 stakeholders, and 3 of them are in the office with me, and then the others are remote, I will immediately try to divert private conversations, or what I like to call undocumented conversations. So inside of asynchronous organizations, all conversations are public. I can be in all meetings at once because all of the documentation is there, because we don't have synchronous meetings. We have asynchronous meetings where we will write down the issues that we need to be able to address as a team. We'll break them down inside of some type of project management system. We use Asana, which is a perfect example. And then we have comments where we debate that particular issue. We come to a conclusion, and then we clear that conclusion from that particular meeting. 5 years from now, I can go back in time and I can actually identify, oh, why did we end up making this decision? Well, it was because Meg decided that she wanted to dye her hair that particular color, even though she looks kind of like a mermaid. We decided to go with it. And now we've got an issue where Disney is suing us because there's a legal issue that we have to deal with. That type of documentation is absolutely critical towards everyone's overall success inside of remote work. And also, more importantly, this becomes so much more important inside of a hybrid model. And then also too, you really have to focus on people's work styles. So if people want to be able to work at 10 p.m., let them work at 10 p.m. If people want to work at 6 o'clock in the morning, let them work at 6 o'clock in the morning. If you're running asynchronous, it doesn't matter when you actually do it, because you can meet whenever, you can collaborate whenever you'd like.
I think that's a really good point, to kind of remind people, is that like yes, you want output from people, but if you're thinking in terms of like what's going to enable that person to be the most productive, then stuff like this just makes sense. Now, one of the things that you've been talking about is this big pushback that is happening, and we could be losing a lot of ground in the advancements that we made, at least in the American workforce, in terms of remote and hybrid options. So for you, from your perspective, where do you see remote work heading in like the next 2 years or so?
It's not going in a good direction, to be completely honest with you. And I'm the one that really wanted it to go in the right direction. I've been working remotely for 20 years. I run a conference on the subject. Our mission as a company is to empower the world's transition towards remote work. So it is frustrating for me to tell you that I think we're probably going to see a further reduction of remote work over 2023. And we're actually starting to see a bifurcation of 2 separate groups. So managers are forcing people back to the office en masse. Executives have actually now increased their remote work. So their remote work is going back up from the bottom of the drop post-pandemic. And employees would like to be able to go back up. We're seeing certain cities where remote work is going just bananas. And then we're seeing other cities that are really returning to a less, to an in-office model. So we're going to see a drop throughout 2023. And there's pretty much no way that we're going to be able to escape that. I think that the critical discussion will be the impact of hybrid work on the mix of work. I actually think that hybrid work is kind of as we had mentioned before, it's the in-between space between remote and in office. And I think whenever you see forced work issues basically elevate to the forefront, that's where you're going to have problems. So anyone that's basically being told, listen, I want to work 4 days remote and 1 day in the office, but your manager is forcing you to do the other, then you're going to see a lot of pushback. So the current economic climate is not creating a really good situation for employees to negotiate. But I think probably by 2024, that's going to change. And my perspective right now, as an investor, as an example, in a lot of remote startups, is I'm doing the vast majority of my investments today in 2023 when we're seeing this gap, because I think 2024, we're going to rebound. And by 2025, I think we're probably going to see close to 60% of the US workforce working primarily remote. And right now we're seeing about 25 to 30% dependent upon the data source that you look at.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to kind of look long term. All right, we have not much time left, but one of the last things I want to talk to you about is one of the bigger misconceptions that businesses have when it comes to remote work. What do you think people need to think of when they're thinking in terms of like, do they really understand this work model?
Mm-hmm. So biggest assumption is you're not recreating the office. You are actually building a new way of working. My personal perspective is the operating system that works best for that is asynchronous management. That's why I spent 2 years writing a book about it. But it really is just that, is if you thought that the old models for the last 100 years, those post-industrial models, are going to serve you in the new world of remote work, it simply won't. You need to be able to adapt your model. And even when we're looking at the next big revolution of artificial intelligence and AI augmented work, I think that this is further going to actually make this a lot more complicated for people, and recognizing that asynchronous management is really the only avenue that people should take to have a successful work environment.
Excellent. I want to say thank you so much, Liam, for taking the time to spend with us today. It's been really, really great to get to listen to you and learn from you on this, and cannot wait to see, hopefully, some of the positive impacts, and maybe we'll be able to kind of circumvent some of that loss of ground when it comes to the remote work setting. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.